Hello, friends, and welcome back to Malicious Compliance Stories. Today's first story centers on a late-night pickup, a suburban street, and a woman who was convinced her driveway was being blocked by a car parked across the street. What follows is an awkward encounter fueled entirely by assumptions. But before we begin, best way to support our channel is to leave comments, like, and subscribe with a turned-on bell so you don't miss the new video every single day. Here we go. Her driveway had 3 lanes. I was parked across the street. The math wasn't mathing for Karen. I always find myself remembering these moments at 4 a.m. when I can't sleep. A few years ago, I was living with my family in Tennessee. I was planning to go to college in another state and practicing my driving for the move. My little brother had started dating a guy in a town about 2 hours away, and they started traveling to conventions together, so my brother asked me if I could drive him to his boyfriend's house so they could go to the convention and then pick him up a few days later. It'd be driving practice for me, and he'd help pay for gas, so I agreed. Dropping him off was no issue. On the return day, I got to the boyfriend's house and texted that I was outside waiting. My brother texted back that they got caught in some traffic and might be about half an hour later than planned. Totally cool. The boyfriend didn't have a driveway at his house, so I parked next to the curb along with some other cars and queued up a podcast. Couple minutes go by, and I feel like I'm being watched. There's a man outside across the street just kind of eyeing me, but I'm a bit of an anxious person, so I try to pay it no mind. He goes inside, then I see a girl probably around 12 to 14, leaves the house, walks across the street in front of my car, checks the mailbox, and goes back inside, glancing at me the whole time. I'm in a kind of rural subdivision, so I can guess I look a little strange sitting in my car on my phone, but I keep telling myself that it's normal for people who drive cars to sit outside waiting for people occasionally. Enter Karen, in a nightgown with a jacket. She comes out of the same house as the man and the girl, motions for me to lower my window, and asks what I'm doing in front of her house. I'm very much parked across the street. I explain that I'm waiting to pick up my brother, but he's running late. She says, "Well, you're blocking my cars. I can't get out." I stick my head out of my window and see that she's gesturing to her 3-lane driveway, which I am very clearly not blocking. A couple cars have driven past me while I've been parked, so I know I'm not blocking the road. And she is, and I cannot emphasize this enough, across the street. I kind of made a face, then looked back at her and said, "Do you need to pull out right now? Because I can drive around the block, but I need to wait here for my brother." Karen kind of huffed and goes back inside without another word. Around 20 minutes later, my brother arrives and we load up his bags into my car. I let him know that we should pick up the pace because the people across the street told me I'm blocking their driveway. He paused in the middle of the road, looked at the huge unblocked driveway and back at my tiny car on the curb and made a face. I said, "I know." It's worth noting that Karen and her family never even started their cars the whole time I was parked. Honestly, this reads like one of those situations where someone decides you're suspicious and then works backward to justify it. The staring, the kid being sent out, the confrontation in pajamas like it's a neighborhood standoff. You weren't blocking anything, and your brother clocked it instantly. I think the reason this memory sticks is because it's uncomfortable in a way that never resolves. No explosion, no apology, just quiet hostility and confusion. And our next story. A tale of 2 neighbors on a mountain. Before I was born, my grandfather retired and made what most people would consider a completely unhinged life decision. He looked at retirement, looked at society, and essentially said, nope. He bought a piece of land in the middle of a mountain, hours away from any real town, with no infrastructure to speak of, no proper roads, no utilities, no neighbors within shouting distance, just trees, rocks, wind, and silence. He loved it. He started by building a small house himself, slowly, one section at a time. When I say built, I mean built, cutting timber, hauling stone, pouring concrete by hand. After about half a year of working on it while living part-time elsewhere, he decided he was done with modern life and moved in permanently. Over the next few years, he added things as needed, a proper wall around his property, storage sheds, and eventually an outdoor toilet behind the house. That toilet will matter later. His only neighbors were an elderly woman who lived uphill from him and a man downhill who can only be described as deeply unstable. The old lady was kind, quiet, and minded her business. The other guy? Not so much. At some point early on, the downhill neighbor decided he wanted to sell his land. My grandfather offered to buy it. He made a reasonable offer based on land value, access, and the fact that it was basically unusable without serious work. The guy laughed and demanded 10 times the amount. They argued, words were exchanged, the deal fell apart, and from that moment on, the crazy neighbor made it his personal mission to ruin my grandfather's life. It started small. He would call communal services and report everything, inspectors, police officers, environmental officers, any authority that existed, he called them. The calls were constant and ridiculous. My neighbor's dog isn't on a leash, he'd report, even though the dog was inside a fully enclosed yard. There are building materials on the road, he'd complain about a road my grandfather had personally built because before that it was just mud. He's violating codes, he'd say, without ever being able to specify which ones. Every time officers had to drive 2 hours up a mountain road to investigate, and every time they found nothing serious, but procedures are procedures, so they kept coming. My grandfather didn't really care. He was busy. He had projects. He liked the quiet. The interruptions were annoying but tolerable. The old lady, however, was not amused. Because of the way the properties were laid out, the only practical path for inspectors to reach my grandfather's place was through her backyard. Meanwhile, the crazy neighbor had sealed off a gate between his property and my grandfather's wall by stuffing it with garbage, literal garbage, rotting waste, construction debris, scrap metal. It blocked access, smelled horrific, and looked like a landfill wedged into a mountain. Every night, my grandfather would clear it. Every morning, the neighbor would rebuild it. Eventually, the old lady had enough. The next time inspectors came, she started asking questions, calm ones, smart ones, legal ones. Over the following weeks, she did some digging of her own and then sat my grandfather down for tea and laid out what she'd learned. First, the wall was entirely on my grandfather's land. That meant it was his property, legally. He could demolish it, rebuild it, modify it, whatever he wanted. Second, filling a gate with garbage was absolutely illegal. Third, and this was important, my grandfather technically had no right to build a gate that opened into someone else's property without explicit permission. If the neighbor pushed the issue in court, the gate would have to be sealed anyway. That's when they came up with the plan. They waited. They waited for late autumn when the rain in the mountains turns relentless, when the ground saturates, streams overflow, and water starts coming down the slopes like it has somewhere urgent to be. When the rain forecast looked perfect, the old lady filed a formal complaint about the smell of the garbage. Inspectors arrived. My grandfather calmly pleaded guilty to the technical violation and signed paperwork agreeing to remove the gate and clear the garbage. That same day, the storm started. For 7 straight days, it poured. What the crazy neighbor didn't know was that my grandfather had quietly cemented 3 of the 4 drainage channels built into the wall months earlier. Combined with the steep slope of the mountain, the wall now acted like a dam. Water pooled and pooled and pooled. The yard behind the wall turned into a lake. It lifted loose debris, it soaked everything. Eventually, the water rose high enough to uproot the outdoor toilet and send it bobbing like some grotesque flotation device. The neighbor panicked. When inspectors finally arrived to remove the garbage and demolish the gate, he tried everything. He begged, he screamed, he threatened, he tried to stop them physically. They ignored him. He didn't own the wall. He'd made the complaints. My grandfather had already accepted fault, meaning there was no appeal path for a third party. The inspectors were sick of the guy and eager to finish the job. The moment the gate was removed, the dam broke. A tidal wave of filthy water, garbage, construction debris, and yes, sewage poured downhill into the neighbor's property. His entire yard flooded. Everything he owned down there was destroyed. My grandfather and the old lady watched it happen from her balcony, sipping tea. Years later, when he told me the story, my grandfather smiled and said, "I felt like a god unleashing a flood on the sinful world," which made me laugh because he's a lifelong atheist. The aftermath was brutal. The neighbor had to pay thousands for cleanup and repairs. Meanwhile, my grandfather's and the old lady's homes were untouched, sitting safely on higher ground. Worse for him, during his attempts to stop the inspectors, he openly admitted that he'd been the one stuffing the gate with garbage. They documented it. Months later, he received a court order requiring him to reimburse my grandfather for property damage. He tried to fight it. The old lady testified he lost. He was ordered to rebuild the gate, cover damages, and pay court fees. Not long after, he sold the property and left. According to the new owner, he sold it for less than half of what my grandfather had originally offered. Some people spend their lives digging holes for others. Sometimes, when the rain comes, they drown in them. There's a quiet philosophical edge to this that I didn't expect. Your grandfather rejected society, authority, and ego-driven conflict, and somehow that made him more effective when conflict finally came. The neighbor needed to be right. Your grandfather just needed to live. When those two mindsets collide, the outcome is rarely fair, but it is predictable. And our next story. Karen harassed while my dad fought cancer. I discovered she was a tenant and had her evicted. This happened about 4 or 5 years ago, and even now, thinking about it makes my shoulders tense. It's one of those experiences that sits quietly in the back of your mind until something reminds you of it, and suddenly you're right back there, jaw clenched, heart racing, wondering how you ever survived that stretch of your life with your sanity intact. At the time, I was trying to buy my first property. That alone is stressful enough, but the timing could not have been worse. My father was in the middle of a brutal cancer fight. Not the kind where you go in once a month and feel lousy for a day or two, but the kind where the treatments are constant, invasive, and leave you barely functional afterward. He was exhausted all the time, in pain, and emotionally drained. We all were. On top of that, there was a bureaucratic nightmare layered over everything. Because of how our healthcare system worked, my father had to prove that he was a resident of our province for more than half the year in order to keep his treatment covered. It didn't matter that he'd lived here most of his life. Paperwork ruled everything. My parents had been staying with a friend in town rent-free while we figured things out, but they no longer owned property locally. That made things complicated. The solution, as absurd as it sounds, was for them to move in with me once I bought a place, get their names on utilities, and establish official residency again. It was a purely administrative move, but a necessary one. After weeks of searching, we found a condo that felt almost too perfect. It was in a small, quiet building. It allowed dogs, which mattered a lot to us, 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and most importantly, it was less than 5 minutes from the hospital. My partner worked there, and my father was receiving treatment there. That proximity mattered more than I can properly explain. When things went wrong, and they often did, being close meant everything. Before committing, we did what you're supposed to do. We reviewed the condo documents, meeting minutes, bylaws, financials. That's when we found it. Years of complaints between the previous owners of our unit and the person living directly below. Noise disputes, accusations flying both ways, police being called. It had escalated badly enough that the condo board hired an independent sound engineer to evaluate the unit. The report was blunt and thorough. The flooring exceeded both city and condo soundproofing requirements by more than double. It concluded that normal living noise from above was unavoidable and compliant. The final sentence was the most important. Any further complaints regarding normal living noise were to be ignored. We talked it over, long discussions, late nights. Ultimately, we decided to move forward. For the first 3 months, everything was calm. No knocks, no emails, no drama. We lived our lives quietly, settled in, and started to feel like we'd made the right choice. Enough time passed that we stopped thinking about the past disputes entirely. Then my parents moved in. As my father's condition worsened, his treatments intensified. He was in and out of the hospital constantly. When he was home, he slept 16 hours a day, sometimes more. That sleep wasn't optional. It was the only thing keeping him functional enough to endure the next round. We adjusted our lives around that. We were careful. We didn't host parties. We didn't blast music. We didn't pace around at night. Everything was quieter, slower, more deliberate. About a week after they moved in, I had a couple of friends over on a Sunday afternoon. It was around noon. They had literally just walked in when there was a sharp, aggressive knock at the door. Standing there was Marissa. She looked young, early 20s at most. She introduced herself as being in pre-med at the nearby university, like that alone should explain everything. Arms crossed, jaw tight, already irritated. "I'm downstairs and I'm trying to study," she said flatly. "Please keep it down." I had rehearsed this conversation in my head after reading the Condo minutes, but it still caught me off guard how quickly it went from zero to accusation. "It's Sunday afternoon," I replied calmly. "We're not having a party, we're just talking. We're always respectful of noise." She stared at me like I'd personally sabotaged her future and walked away without another word. Later that day, trying to be reasonable, I went out and bought a pair of high-quality noise-canceling earbuds. I left them outside her door with a note apologizing for any unintentional noise and gently reiterating that nothing we were doing violated bylaws. I honestly thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. A few days later, I was rearranging furniture in my parents' room. Nothing dramatic, no dragging heavy objects, no dropping things, just moving a chair and shifting a small dresser to make more space around the bed. Then came the banging. Hard, deliberate, violent thuds from below. Once, twice, 3 times. Before I could even process what was happening, there was furious pounding on my door. "What the F are you doing up here?" she screamed the moment I opened it. I was stunned, completely taken aback. "Were you just banging on the ceiling with a broom?" I asked. "You bet I was," she snapped. "You're stomping around. I'm studying. I can't focus." "If you have a complaint," I said, now genuinely angry, "take it to the condo board. Banging on the ceiling and screaming at us is unacceptable." I shut the door in her face. I contacted the condo board immediately. To their credit, they agreed that her behavior was out of line. They issued a warning stating that any further harassment, including banging on walls or ceilings, would result in maximum fines per incident. Her mother responded instead, a long venomous email accusing us of being inconsiderate, disruptive, and cruel. She made it very clear that her daughter's education mattered more than anything else in the building. She even took shots at our physical appearance, which was both bizarre and revealing. The board softened. For about a week, things were quiet. Then the music started. Whenever we walked across the floor, whenever something dropped accidentally, whenever a chair scraped slightly, the music would start. Loud, aggressive, bass-heavy. I could clearly hear lyrics through the floor. Cabinets vibrated. Dishes rattled. Worse, she would often turn it on and leave the unit entirely. 12 hours, 14 hours, 16 hours straight, day after day. Police could only issue warnings. The condo board refused to fine her. Emails went unanswered. Calls were ignored. My father's health visibly declined under the constant stress and lack of rest. I started documenting everything. Dates, times, decibel readings, patterns. And eventually, I noticed something important. Her name wasn't on the ownership records. Marissa didn't own the unit. Her mother did. That meant Marissa was legally a tenant. And tenants could be evicted. I obtained the land title, cross-referenced it with condo bylaws, highlighted every relevant clause. I waited. On a freezing Thursday night in February, I requested a meeting with the board. I arrived with logs, decibel readings, copies of bylaws, email chains, and a letter drafted by a lawyer friend outlining the board's liability if they continued to ignore the issue. They were tired, irritated, clearly hoping I'd go away. I read the letter aloud. Their posture changed. Then I invited them into my unit. We stood in the kitchen while the same song blasted from below. Bass rattled utensils, conversation required raised voices. "She's not even home," I said quietly. That realization hit them hard. The next morning, she was moving out. I stood at the window in my bathrobe, coffee in hand, watching her load a U-Haul through knee-deep snow. She looked cold, miserable, and furious. She saw me. I waved. Later that day, the board emailed to confirm they had threatened eviction and maximum fines for any future complaint. She chose to leave instead. For the first time in months, my father slept peacefully, and the building was finally quiet again. You did everything people always say you should do, and it still took months for anyone to take you seriously. The fact that your father's health was wrapped up in all of this makes it even harder to read. That kind of stress doesn't just disappear when the noise stops. I'm glad you held your ground and forced accountability, because that situation wasn't going to fix itself. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.